So I was telling Danny as we were kind of playing with our slides out in the hallway that one of my existential experiences in life is being given an ambiguous task for which I have no model and doing it wrong. So I probably did this wrong, but hopefully you'll bear with me. I think it's interesting and hopefully relevant to the larger conversation that's been initiated by this conference. I'm talking about these relationships between policy, organizational logics, and teacher learning. And that's going to be my way into thinking about what might we anticipate is going to come out of Common Core as a sort of a policy mechanism for improvement, for changing instruction. And can we learn from prior examples of policy and the relationship that we can trace into teacher learning to kind of make some conjectures about what might work and what might be better policy designs if we're really aiming for the kind of teaching and learning that we're hoping to engender in schools. So also feel free to tweet. That's my Twitter handle, and Naila and I kind of came up with this Spark Me hashtag, very original, but I've heard that there's a kind of sub-Sparkle Me that's been going on. I don't know if that's actually happened, Charlotte, but it's the alt channel. So I guess that's where you get to comment on people's like quirks and stuff. Okay, of which I have many. So the question I'm trying to I'm thinking of this as sort of a chat, not a formal talk. So I'll talk to you about some data and some research and studies. But I'm really wanting to open a conversation around this question of how can we think about the relationships among policy, organizational logics, and teacher learning to leverage improvements in math instruction. And I'm taking as shared sort of a common vision of what that math instruction might look like. I think someone said earlier, we probably aren't 100% aligned on that, but I bet, like, compared to the rest of the world, we're more aligned than most random groups of folks that you'd gather. And I'm going to look across these layers, talk about policy, the relation to organizational logics, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about teacher learning because that's what my research is about. Oh, there's a circle that's supposed to pop up when I say that. Okay. The policy I want to look at is No Child Left Behind. I'm not going to go into a whole big, long thing about it. Most of you are probably familiar with it. But in case you've been doing something else, not in the US, for the last 15 years, let me tell you that the key kind of features of it for what I'm about to describe are that, it's this federal legislation that's holding schools accountable for improvement through one thing. The mechanism is through standardized test scores. And as a part of that, all public school students are tested in math and reading and English. Now I think some are adding science. But every year from grades 3 to 8, and then once in high school. And that part of the mechanism here is that states are required to bring all students up to proficiency levels, as shown through this adequate yearly progress, the goals that are set out by the policy. And there's a whole bunch of things I could say about that I'm not going to. So my question is, so how does a policy like this show up in teachers' sense-making? As Paul was referencing, I've spent hundreds of hours of my life watching videos of teachers talking together. And so what I'm doing when I do that is I'm trying to figure out how are they making sense of what they're doing and what their work is. And policy shows up. And Paul and Kara have written a paper talking about policy as learning design, that we can actually think of policy as since it's trying to change the behavior of some target population, that we can look at things like the what, why, and how of policy to think about how it's trying to reach in there and influence and change people. And what they propose is that we can look at things at the level of an organization, at the new positions that are formed in response to a policy, the kinds of events that are formed, the new organizational routines and new tools that arise to be responsive. So we can look at NCLB through this lens as learning design and think about what is this this why, what, and how for the rationale for like why we're doing this. So the why is supposed to be to remediate longstanding educational disparities and hold schools accountable to doing that work. And the what is to be able to have more equitable educational outcomes across student subgroups. And where this policy becomes super problematic is in the how, because the mechanism for accountability is really, really well specified. This whole thing about proficiency rates and annual yearly progress targets. But the instructional means, which is what teachers do every day in school, are completely underspecified. And that was obviously a pragmatic choice on, because as we know, we've all lived through the math wars. We know we can't tell people how to teach without getting, although Alan, of course, doesn't care. He's going to conquer the world with true math anyway. But in this policy, the instructional means aren't specified. Okay? So all of this is going on, and teachers are having to deal with it, and schools are having to deal with this. And I'll show you in a bit like how that looks in schools. But at the same time, schools aren't homogeneous places, right? They all kind of operate with different kind of priorities and different what we call organizational logics. And what we've seen in the MIST project is that there's kind of two prevailing responses to this accountability policy. There's a logic that we call the instructional management logic, which is, okay, we're going to take these test scores, these standardized test scores, and we're going to use this to reorganize instructional work. We're going to reallocate resources with this goal of meeting these targets. Then there are also some places that are trying to use it toward instructional improvement. No, our job is to teach kids. We're going to grow our teachers. We're going to use these test scores to identify effective and ineffective teaching practices, figure out what our kids are having a hard time with. This is going to be information. This is going to be feedback for us to get better. And we're going to invest in our teachers' development. These are obviously not mutually exclusive, but we find this a handy shorthand for describing the organizational logics we see in school. So these organizational logics end up shaping the local instantiation, the local learning designs, the local positions, learning events, organizational routines, and tools that arise in response to the policy. Okay, everybody with me? Yep. Okay, cool. I'm going to take a little detour right now, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think about teacher learning. Historically, teacher learning has been studied by looking at kind of ideal types, doing like interview survey kind of study, looking at classrooms and trying to infer what teachers know. I do it differently. I listen to teachers talk about their work. And when I listen to teachers talk, I kind of think of them as found talk aloud protocols about their pedagogical reasoning. Teachers are talking and they're discussing and they're making sense of their instructional decisions. And this is for me, a really rich place to park my camera and collect all this video and try to look for how are they making sense of things and what are the opportunities that they have to learn about the work of teaching in these conversations. And the way I operationalize this idea of opportunities to learn, which answers this question, how do teachers' conversations stand to support new forms of practice and understanding? I look at two things. I look at what kind of conceptual resources are being developed, negotiated, and deployed in the conversations, and I'm looking at how are teachers being mobilized for their future work. So there's two things I look for. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of an opportunity to learn. This is from a group of teachers that has developed a new routine in response to NCLB policy where they have midterm assessment data that they're looking at and trying to understand. So they're looking at the kids' work, and one teacher says, looking at the problem in the test booklet, one thing that threw them, they're used to seeing the dimensions on the sides, but they labeled it differently. So he's observing that the way the diagram was labeled in the test booklet was different than how kids were used to seeing it in class. Dimensions is one of those words with multiple meanings, another teacher observes. Not using the formal term policy, but, realizing, well, yeah, that's like an example of this thing that's confusing and is often confusing. We need to go over that more. So we're developing a concept here that kids get into habits about seeing things in a certain way, that there are certain kinds of words that are particularly troublesome if they have multiple meanings. We need to attend to those things in our instruction. Is this like a super rich, delightful learning opportunity? No, but there's something going on here, right? In other work, when I look at teachers talking together, there's two things I want to point out that are really, really consequential for the kinds of learning opportunities that go on when teachers talk together. The first is that epistemics matter, and I'll explain more what that means. And the second is that accomplished teachers talk differently about their work than less accomplished teachers. So what do I mean by epistemic stances? I'm talking about work groups, teacher work groups' perspectives on what can be known, how to know it, and why it's of value. So not all teachers coming together have the same views, same values on teaching, learning, and mathematics, and they don't all care about the same things. They're not all pursuing the same set of questions. And the way these epistemic stances manifest is they manifest at different timescales in conversation and activity. In the moment, sometimes people will make these kind of bald epistemic claims, these declarations about what matters and why. And over time, it's more at the level of activity structures and what's being emphasized that's revealing what groups care about and what they think matters. So here's an example of an epistemic stance. It comes from another data examination meeting. This has become a new event in response to the NCLB policy that schools do all the time. So this is a principal talking to a group of teachers, and he says, the importance of this before we get started is to dig deep, to make sure that we're meeting kids' individual needs, that we're talking to them about their test scores, and that we're having those conversations that motivate them. So this whole second half is like, he's saying what matters and what the purpose is and why we do this stuff. It matters to motivate kids by talking to them. And that's why we're looking at test scores. So he's giving a framing almost of what the activity is going to be. And all I'm going to say, again, I'm being kind of telegraphic and conversational and all of that, but when I look across teacher work groups and I look at teachers at different levels of accomplishment in what we would call ambitious practice, the epistemic stances, that's like the thing that distinguishes them. If I have studio code and I like code epistemic stances and I play a movie just of that code, I can tell you exactly what's going on in those classrooms because it distinguishes the teacher work groups so much. Like it's like mind-blowing. It was my biggest eureka moment as a researcher when I played those movies. Okay, accomplished teachers talk differently in meetings together. They spend more time discussing problems of practice. They do more of linking broad ideas about teaching with local particulars. And they also more frequently consider students' affective and cognitive experiences. So putting this together, my graduate student, Brittany Kane, and I, we describe this as an ecological view of students teaching in mathematics. When we listen to these accomplished teachers talk about these three critical dimensions of teaching, it's like these things kind of go together. You can't just talk about what are you teaching today without considering, well, what's the math? What do kids have trouble with? And we talk about, the metaphor I use is it's like a mobile. You pull a corner and the whole thing spins together. You can't just think about one of those facets in isolation. So if that's what I've learned about teacher learning from listening to teachers talk, what happens when a policy like No Child Left Behind enters the picture and enters teachers' sense-making? Okay, well, we wrote a paper about this, and Joni couldn't be with us, Joni Wilson, but she was an author on this. And we looked at a couple of schools from the MISS project that were looking and using data. And I'm going to show you a group that is working under what we would call the instructional management logic. So they're really thinking about how to reallocate resources to make these proficiency cut points. It's a school we call Creekside, and we picked it to look at because they were responding to NCLB with what I would say is high fidelity. They were good soldiers in this regime. They were trying to make their AYP scores. And this, again, is the principal talking. And he has this long, they go through this whole activity. Hold on, let me take that off. I'll start reading it. They go through this whole activity with them about, like, here's the kids' test scores. It's only the African American kids. The school is getting rid of their instructional coach, talking about new roles, but they have a full-time data manager, because that's responsive to the policy. We don't need coaches anymore. We need data managers. And the data managers put together these beautiful spreadsheets that are color-coded by kids' names with their test scores. Red, meaning not doing so well. Yellow, those are the bubble kids. Green, these kids are already proficient. And the question the teachers are asked is, how many of these kids that are yellow do you think that you can get to green? Okay? And I always think of you, Danny, when I look at this data, because you challenged us in that JRME article that you mentioned to think about the reinstantiation of race. And this has become a way of coding race without talking about race through these kinds of conversations. So when I broke down the numbers, the principal says, just based on the data, because I don't see the kids every day, I was sitting somewhere around a 55 to 58% could go and get somewhere. Blah. This is getting confusing. Okay. We could go and get somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 43% of the kids. We're just working on growth, which is kind of alarming numbers. You guys think we can get more kids over the hump, and that's encouraging. So you guys are saying, that the number's probably closer to 60 to 65% that we can either get, to bubble, passing, or committed. So he's talking about how many kids we can move from bubble over to proficient. So this is like a triage thing. And that's encouraging news, especially with the most difficult sub-pop. And there we've got the coded language. But there's all these ideas that are being conveyed about what teaching is, about what students are and who students are. And that's happening in this activity. And this is becoming a part of teachers' conceptual system for what matters in their work. And at the end of this meeting, the instructional coach whose job is now gone, sort of summarizes for the teachers. I think it's easy to overlook the kids that are borderline, especially if they're real quiet in class. We sometimes overlook them. And so just to make us open our eyes and say, this student, they're keeping themselves, but they're still a bubble kid. And they're still a child that could be pushed up to commended or passing. So just kind of open our eyes to see what kids are in our room. So, she's making this epistemic claim about the nature of teaching, that it's easy to overlook kids that are borderline. But she's also, at the same time, in this statement, she's naturalizing the policy language. This has become part of the conceptual system through which she's describing children in the school. So I just want to point out that happens, because that's all I can say, because I'm running out of time. But let's revisit this question. How can we think about the relationships among policy, organizational logics, and teacher learning to leverage improvements in math instruction? Well, my claim is that policy shapes teacher learning opportunities by shifting what counts in teaching, and that these organizational logics, and there's probably more of them out there, the ones that we're talking about are this instructional improvement, instructional management, as sort of the dominant ones we've seen in our project. But they mediate the policy by rendering certain positions, learning events, and routines and tools as sensible. So it's sensible to get rid of your instructional coach and have a full-time data manager when that's what the policy is demanding, right? But in turn, these things shape teacher learning opportunities by shifting the conceptual resources and emphasizing what's valued in future work. Now, I know that's like really depressing, and I'm sorry. I do want to say, though, that teachers and schools can exert agency in policy implementation. And in her study of the schools using Title I schools' use of ESEA, she documented, Sandra Stein documented these instances of what she called thoughtful noncompliance, right? This kind of resistant way that you can kind of like feed the policy beast, but do good teaching anyway. And kind of resist these labels and languages that come out of the policy. But here's the rub. Thoughtful noncompliance, where I've seen it, seems to be best supported by teachers' pedagogical sophistication. Okay? So how do we get teachers here to this place where they have this really deep ecological view of teaching and learning and mathematics when we're working in a system that's not valuing these forms of instruction? Oh, it's going to animate. I cut and paste. Okay. But how do we get teachers here in ways that make schools a workplace tenable? So part of the reason I'm on Twitter is because they like talking to teachers there. And the other day, this teacher named Kate Nowak, she's an ambitious teacher. She knows how, she's got it going on mathematically, but she's feeling so frustrated. She's saying we are judged on terrible tests which measure, in her state, terrible standards. And this is the system teachers are working in. So even when we bring in something like Common Core, if we don't address the systemic issues, and somebody earlier was talking about the kind of popular discourses of Common Core is being brought in through NCLB. This is the mechanism for disseminating it, and NCLB has been so problematic. Thanks.